Hey fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and you know, a lot of artists will use, in place of traditional gesso, just some regular old house paint. But should they be doing that, and is it just the same? That and more coming up. So I believe it was when I was sanding down layers and layers of paint off of a wood panel to make it new again in a vlog from a couple months ago, and I realized, oh, these people definitely used house paint in place of gesso because it's just a white primer coat, right? It all works the same. It's like, well, no. And it's something I've actually run across online a lot. There's just other artists and creators be like, oh, well, I don't have gesso. Well, just grab some house paint out of your garage. It works fine. It's all the same. You just need it to be white. That's not really the case. And there's a lot of problems that regular house paint creates when you prime your surfaces with it. So for this video, I decided to take house paint and gesso across multiple different samples to give that full ultimate test to show you guys exactly why house paint and gesso are not necessarily the same thing. Now, before we jump into my findings, I want to tell you guys exactly what I did for this project. So I took this piece of, it's probably oak, it's a nice solid piece of wood, spray painted it gray, actually, to give it mostly a nice visual to the whole thing. And then took samples of regular medium cotton duck canvas, stapled those down to stretch a little bit, as well as put the samples of the gesso and house paint on here as well. So on the right side of this, we have the house paint samples. On the left side, we have the gesso samples.
For God's sake, man, do you not know your right from your left?
I also did both oil and acrylic paint for each of these tests. We have a gradient test, a glaze test, and a knife work and scrubbing test. We'll be getting more into depth for all of these as we go. And this was just a way to test the medium across all of these surfaces and, you know, various techniques and all that. Each of the samples of the white primer in either case were done with 2 coats. Didn't sand in between, just laid them down real simple. Nothing fancy, since the the examples themselves are a lot smaller, obviously. And as one final note, as I'm talking about my findings throughout this, I did record the entire painting process of these, though it's a little bit out of order. So it's 1, 2, 3 here, but I've kind of painted it in a 1, 3, 2 manner. I will do my best to keep the video as close to what I'm talking about as I can, but do note there is going to be a little bit of a disconnect there. And for those 2 primers, as I kind of showed a little here in the intro, I have my regular Utrecht Artist Acrylic Gesso and some Super Duty Valspar Signature paint and primer, satin in sheen ultra white interior paint. Okay, so let's talk about the actual tests here. So the first test was a gradient or blue sky. I figured that was the simplest thing I could do to show the simple, you know, early painting techniques in that sense. We're going to go ahead and start with the acrylic house paint side. I found that the heavy body paint lays on fairly smooth over the house painted samples, although thin applications started to resist and puddle and pool up a little bit. So as I thinned with water, it started to bead up on the surface. Moving over to the house paint wood side of that, the paint blended really well, but my brush dragging across felt really streaky. Now onto the gesso side of the acrylic portion of this, I found that the gessoed surfaces actually seem to grip the paint a little bit more than the house paint, just where it just sort of sat on the surface. The gesso sort of allowed the paint to absorb into the surface a little bit more. As we go forward, you're going to see that this is going to be a recurring theme. The gessoed wood does exactly what the canvas does, whether thick or thin application of that paint. It definitely grips and holds on to the paint rather than letting it just kind of sit on top of the surface. Now when I switched to oil on the house paint side, I found that the paint actually sort of bled around the top and surface of that gessoed, or that house painted primed surface. It just kind of sat, and it almost started to push out on its own and do its own thing, which I found to be a little frightening when grabbing that paint and putting it onto that surface. When I moved over to the gesso support, though, for the oil, I found that rather than bleeding across the surface, the paint instead more glided. And this was really useful because it helped again, like the acrylic, it kind of adheres into that surface rather than sitting on top of it. And that ability to glide across the surface while still blending allows you to mix your paint on the canvas without necessarily sacrificing the textural integrity of the canvas or the wood, and still allows you to get some complex blends in the process. Now again, as I mentioned before, I kind of bounced around based on what was wet and what was dry. So I jumped into using some knife work. I decided to take two colors and on either side with some thick and heavy knife work strokes, and then in the middle grab a nice stiff brush and just kind of scrub those two colors together to show how rough I can be with each of those surfaces. Acrylics on house paint, for this test, I found that scraping reveals a lot more of the white with the house paint. Much like painting the gradients, I found that the acrylic on the house paint definitely sort of slid across the surface rather than absorbing in. And the colors just don't seem to mix and blend more complexly when all they're doing is just kind of sliding around on that surface. And that went for both the gesso, or both the canvas and the wood primed with house paint. Now when I moved over to gesso, I found that scraping reveals a lot less white. Again, this is a huge thing. It means the paint's really going into the weave of the fibers of the canvas and mixing and sitting into that texture rather than sitting on top of it. Now, moving over to the gesso side of things, when it came to the knife work, I found that, again, that scraping, it's revealing a lot less white because the paint's going into the surface rather than sitting on top of it. Same goes for when I started scrubbing with that. The brush really kind of pushed the paint into the canvas rather than, again, sitting on top and just smearing. And the exact opposite of mixing on the house paint surface, we're mixing on a gesso canvas. Any blending and mixing of that color definitely feels a lot more complex. Now, the knife and scrubbing for oil was kind of a mixed bag of results. I found that the best scraping worked on the house-painted wood as well as the gessoed canvas, so kind of a split decision there. Painting oil with the wood gesso side blends, while the wood house paint side smears. But of course, we're looking at the same in the canvas versus on the canvas issue that I've been talking about this whole time. Sits on top of the house paint versus goes into the canvas, more so when you're using gesso. Another thing I found that, especially for the scraping and more heavy brushwork, is that the resistance of house paint definitely keeps the paint wet longer. However, I do worry a little bit about the level of pore adhesion that would create. Obviously, I didn't have quite enough time to let that oil paint dry, but you can guarantee I will be following up in the future once I know exactly how much that adhesion makes a difference when the paint does eventually dry. The third and final test, but middle one on the board, honestly was nothing groundbreaking. I thought this was going to be the most interesting of the three, but it ended up being kind of the least interesting. For each sample, I put a layer of dark gray acrylic down the center and just glaze across the raw, not the raw, but the primed canvases and wood with both oil and acrylic as a result. The acrylic, once again, the same layering and adhesion issues as previous. Paint sits on top with the house paint. Paint absorbs more into the canvas, even with glazing, when you're using gesso. Although I did find, especially with the glazes, that the gesso created a richer depth of color when using glaze, more so than it does on the house paint. I think I would say the biggest thing I noticed is when I switched to oil, and the grab and the float versus grab mentality that I've been talking about all video was the most pronounced when glazing with oil. The grab of the gessoed support really, really, really stands out, where in the other tests it was more of a subtle thing, but as soon as I glazed oil over a gessoed support, that was immediately noticeable. Across the board, though, for the glazing with oil on either support, I found that visually they looked exactly the same, but the working quality and properties, the general feel of it, is the only thing I really noticed to be different. Visually it looked the same, but the feel is wildly different. Sorta. So what do we take away from all of these tests? Well, I think the big question ends up being, well, which one's better? Which one should I use? Personally, I would say don't grab any old random house paint you have sitting around your basement or garage to prep your surface, especially whether you're a beginner or not, I feel it just doesn't create an adequate surface. Gesso isn't just a white primer. Traditionally, gesso has either ground gypsum or calcium carbonate in the mixture itself to give that grabbiness that you need out of a primer coat. Now, no one's asking you to buy an entire gallon bucket like this if you're a beginner. I mean, I use a lot of gesso myself because I stretch and prime my own canvases from scratch. But if you're gonna start getting into more custom supports, there's absolutely no reason to cheapen out with an off-the-shelf house paint when gesso not only works 1,000 times better than house paint and also won't give you the same weird adhesion issues that I was having with the house painted samples. You want your paint to stick and to work into the canvas. And though it may be kind of subtle to see in the video and pictures and everything, I found that the colors themselves mixed and looked way more complex on a gessoed surface than they ever did sitting on top and pooling over the house paint. And as a side note, some people say, well, okay, I won't use the house paint. I'll just grab regular white acrylic and use that in place of the house paint. It's the exact same problem of the surface not being grippy enough to really pull and hold on to that paint to be sure it adheres well to the canvas or wood or whatever you happen to be painting on. Now, as one final test, and this is something I waited for this video to do, at least this part of the video to do, and that is going to be a scrape test. Now, I talked about this a little bit in my video on how to thin acrylics with water. And it was, oh, you shouldn't never thin acrylics with water and this and this and that, whatever. It's a complete myth. I will link the video probably in a card around here or in the description box below. One thing I talked about in the video was a poorly primed substrate. So whether that be something that's too smooth or something that is dirty underneath the paint, something's not sticking. In that case, the paint may flake or chip off over time or have problems with scraping. Now, I can only do this with the acrylic side. The oil, all of the oil samples are still wet. I mixed with some Galca gel for all of those samples in hopes that maybe by today that they would be dry, but it's been less than a day, so obviously they're not going to be. I will follow up on that once they do dry fully, probably in about 2 or 3 months. But I was really curious on this. So this general scrape test, I'm just going to do a little bit on the sample of each of these. I will probably can't really see it super well from your distance, but I will certainly report. I'm definitely able to lift some of the acrylic on the canvas house paint. Very, very, very easily scraping it off of the wood house paint. Possible to scrape it on gesso and wood, but definitely a lot harder. Gesso on canvas, again, possible, but I feel like I would have to go really out of my way to get a lot more of that off. So it definitely scrapes a lot more when you're just using the house paint. Glazing layers, probably really similar. That really easily is just starting to chip. Yeah, that's scratching it right off with the house paint. A lot more difficult to do it with the gesso. Basically impossible to do it with the gesso on canvas. And that's for a thin application of paint. The thicker stuff, super thick applications aren't going to come off super easily. Scrubbed in, it's a little bit better. Same as before, scraping on the wood, anything that with the house paint on it, it's doing a little bit better, but because of the thickness of the paint, but it is still happening. I don't even think I can get that to happen on the gesso for either sample. So if you're worried about your paint chipping, flaking, or doing anything off of your substrate, don't use the house paint. Now, I know this was a lot of information to throw you guys all at once, and it's honestly a lot of information to condense down into a video as short as this one is. Short. So in order to make all of this information a lot more digestible, in the description box below, I have a link to a Google Docs file, which is the complete and full write-up of this entire project with images. So if you want to digest all of this information a little bit slower and on your own time, you can read that full write-up there. It is already available if you just click the link in the description box below. So there you have it. If you only have house paint lying around, I mean, I guess it'll work, but it's not going to give you the same results of using actual gesso. Chances are your best bet is going to be to just grab a canvas off the shelf and just use that. A lot of artists will say, well, you have to prime your canvas regardless. That's a personal preference. If it's white and off the shelf already, it's already white and you pull it off the shelf, you don't have to gesso that. You don't need to, period. But if you're going to be doing a lot more custom prep work, don't just grab random house paint to do that. Use gesso. There's more in gesso than just paint. And as a result, your paintings will not only look better, but they will last longer, and you won't have weird adhesion issues and weird mixing issues, honestly. The whole working properties of the paint change slightly when you're working on that smooth of a surface. So if you found this video useful or enjoyed this deep exploration into different techniques on two different primers, so to speak, for painting, hit the like button, let me know your thoughts and comments. If I missed anything or jumped over something you didn't see, feel free to ask a question. This was a very complicated video to make. And I had a blast doing it, but man, this is a lot of information. Again, that's why I've linked in the description box below that full write-up for this entire process. As always, get subscribed if you're not already. Check me out in socials in the description box below. And this has been from Cinder Studios, reminding you to keep on creating, and I will see you guys next time. Oh my god! This video was nuts! It's a reason it took an extra week to do all this.